The topic we're going to be discussing today is agree to disagree. How constructive conflict drives innovation. First, I want you to think about a time when you can remember first experiencing conflict. Now, this can be personal or work. You don't have to share that time. That may be something personal, but it's that time you realize what conflict is. How do I relate to conflict? And then share in the chat the one word that comes to mind when recalling that experience. Just that one word: frustration, scary, nervous, uncomfortable, embarrassment, sad, stressed, confused, fearful, awkward. Unfortunately, we all arrive to our workplaces with our conflict origin story. And we sort of almost sometimes can almost go back in time, right? We start to feel similarly, maybe react similarly, and we developed then the way we deal with conflict. Now, here's the thing. When you arrive to the workplace and you've got your conflict origin story with you, you have to remember there's actually two types of conflict, because I'm going to guess that the type of conflict that conjured up that one word for you was probably interpersonal conflict, right? It was probably related to a relationship, an individual, a group. Except when you get to the workplace, you have to actually distinguish that second type of conflict, which is task conflict. This is where we differ on process, what the goal should be. It's the how that we differ in. Now, here, we want to understand that we're not engaging in interpersonal conflict when we are engaging appropriately in task conflict, right? We're not attacking a person. We're inviting discussion about the process, about the how. Here's the thing. Sometimes we just lump all the conflict together, we avoid it, and we don't leverage, we miss the opportunity in that second form of conflict, in that task conflict. So when we avoid conflict altogether because we bundled it all up in one, we're avoiding growth, right? We're avoiding innovation. We're avoiding ideas. We're avoiding even sometimes necessary trust that can be built from actually getting things out in the open. And so we have to learn and provide teaching for people of how we leverage conflict. And we do that by creating conditions where conflict is safe and productive. Well, how do we do that? Well, that's not a one-day thing. That's not a workshop. That's not a book. But I'm going to give you one tiny little takeaway before we move to our expert panel. And this is something that I teach over and over and over again when I'm teaching leaders how to have difficult conversations. How you start is everything. The first thing you say is going to set the tone for the rest of the conversation. So for example, I have something I'd like to discuss with you that I think will help us work together more effectively. Or I'd like to talk about blank with you, but first I'd like to get your point of view. I think we have different perceptions about blank. I'd like to hear your thinking on this. I'd like to see if we might reach a better understanding about blank. I really want to hear your feelings about this and share my perspective as well. If you want to screenshot right now, these are secret weapons. They are magical because these types of conversation openers create something. What do you think these types of conversations, what do they create? Safety, positive energy, neutrality, trust, harmony, collaboration instead of argument. The power of maybe it feels lighter, differentiation. We're going to talk a little bit about how we create this safety. I am excited to introduce my expert panel. First, want to welcome Katie Myers. She is the Chief People Officer of the YMCA of Greater Cincinnati. And next, I'm going to welcome Kevin Mills. He is with INSP. He's the VP of Organizational Development. All right, so let's start off with a question that really relates to something we just shared. So how do we help teams understand? Like we talked about how we kind of mush conflict all together into one. How do we help teams understand the distinction between interpersonal and task conflict and why the latter is this source of innovation? So Kevin, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think for us, we have what we call the mirror reflection test, and we teach all of our employees to really ask 6 challenging questions when we're faced with conflict, and those are surrounded by the idea of being vulnerable with yourself and recognizing kind of where this conflict is coming from and why I'm challenged. So through that, we really work hard to understand, is this a personal conflict or is this a task related conflict? If it's a personal conflict, then then we can address it as that. But if it's a task related conflict, it completely changes the dynamics of how we approach the situation. And so for us, we really strive for and lean into healthy conflict. We really try to lean into what we call preference of diversity and diversity preference, and really this idea that if we have a greater amount of people in the room with a difference of backgrounds and experiences and obtain life challenges, then we have the ability to see the task or the conflict in a completely different way. And for us, we truly feel like that does lead to innovation. We truly feel like that allows us to get outside of our norm, our everyday experiences, or our everyday result, and continue to grow and develop. And so we really do. We teach this mirror reflection test, and everybody on our team. Right now we have about 950 employees throughout our organization, and every one of them have a mirror on their table or on their chair, or wherever it is that they keep it. But it challenges them to really take that time to be vulnerable with their self and ask, where is this conflict rooted, and how do I lean into that in a healthy way?
That's great. And sometimes just doing that quick reflection again shifts the entire interaction, right? So just taking that time, those couple of extra minutes, preparation's everything, right? Those couple extra minutes can really make a difference. Awesome. So Katie, how about you?
So if for those of you that know anything about the YMCA, what I've learned when I started working is that everybody leads with their heart. And so this personal conflict comes into play so much because that's just how everybody takes it. So we're trying to really work and coach our teams to kind of speak the same as Kevin is saying, is just understanding you and what you bring to the table and who you're surrounded by, knowing their strengths, their voices, and having that reflection piece of now I want to go get mirrors now that Kevin's talking about that. But you just have to understand yourself before you can understand somebody else, and not taking it personally. So the advantages of the task conflict and driving innovation is that what Kevin spoke to, diverse perspective, that's the biggest piece. Understanding that diversity of thought, what that can lead to in a conversation, and the critical thinking, the problem solving that happens, and not taking it personally where somebody's attacking me because of my opinion. It's more of the curiosity and questioning to get a better understanding. And when you can create that atmosphere, that just leads into all discussing the challenges and the problems and coming up with a solution together. So it just builds upon each other. And it does. And what you said, Stephanie, at the beginning is a note that I made to myself. It doesn't happen overnight. This is something you have to build with your teams to understand, and just, again, looking within first and then bringing that out to everybody else on the team.
So what I'm really getting from both of you is that we have to not only encourage self-reflection, but we also have to give people structure for self-reflection, right? We can't just say, oh, now you're going to reflect, right? We have to encourage people. Leaders have to model that, right? Leaders have to teach that. Leaders have to say, this is how we want to approach this, right? And it may be difficult for some people, right? Some people are like, well, I'm at work, I don't want to reflect, right? And they create this very fine line. But we can't just expect people to reflect. We have to teach them what that looks like, give them a structure for it, give them tools and resources that help them do it, right? So let's go to sort of the environment level. And Kevin, I'll bounce this back to you. What aspects of a work environment have to be in place to create that safe space for people to express views and even challenge the process?
Yeah. So first and foremost, trust. I think for our organization, everything that we do, we're rooted in a belief. And so the way that we approach our expectation of our team, our employees, is what we call our applicable leadership method, which is our belief, our core belief, our fundamental beliefs that are what we're rooted in, and then we're driven by our values, and that's demonstrated in our behaviors. So for us, one of our core values is trust. And And for that, I mean, we genuinely feel like trust is earned. And, you know, and I know that there's a lot of people that are probably cringing, but we believe that trust is earned, not necessarily given. And so for us, you know, we teach that when you go into a room that it's not always healthy just to assume that others trust you. It's not healthy to just walk in with the expectation that others give you the trust that you would hope that they would, but that's earned. We believe that trust is earned through clarity, transparency, empathy, and then consistency. And so we teach these things to our team. We really lean into being clear. Say what you mean what you say, hold people to the expectations and call it out when you're not getting it. You know, the transparency of who I am, how I show up, what that means to me. But empathy, you know, Katie mentioned empathy is so big. We teach the Ted Lasso method of empathy, of be curious, not judgmental. And then it's consistency. It has to happen consistently. It can't just be one time. It can't even be twice. It has to be, how do I show up every day? And so when we're talking about creating an environment where people can come in and feel open and feel able and empowered to share their thought, to challenge, to even have some disagreements, it has to start with a foundation of trust and or the understanding that you may not necessarily trust me, and I can approach that from a different perspective if I don't think that you do or if I'm not sure that you do. So we teach our teams to go in and really lean into those 4 areas. And then if you are walking into a new room and you don't know that they trust you, then be cognizant of that. And that's okay, because it does change the way that you show up and it changes the way that you approach that particular conflict.
Excellent. Thank you so much for really some of that clarity. Also, Katie, how would you add to that?
Yeah, talking about trust, the big buzzword now, psychological safety. So it's really creating that space. And what you said earlier, Stephanie, takes our leaders to model it. And that's where it starts. And when we don't have that at the top, modeling this and creating that safe space, it's going to affect the whole culture of the organization and all the other teams below. So transparency, communication is huge. So if you are what they call the ivory tower, you're sitting there in your seat and you're making all these decisions, but you're not communicating with all the other staff members, that's where the trust is going to go away, because what are you hiding behind? How are you making these decisions? Why aren't you informing us? So in order to build that trust from the top, you have to be communicating what's going on, the why behind everything. And when people start seeing that, that's how that trust gets built. Creating a space for constructive feedback. So regular feedback sessions, an example, what we did in my organization, just like revamping a performance management. It shouldn't be an annual review, having one conversation. Check in every quarter, have a conversation. That's all it is open conversation. This isn't some type of rating or dinging you for whatever it could be, but how do you feel? How are you doing in your job? What do you need from me as your supervisor to create that space? And then in turn, when they start trusting and opening up, you need to empower them. When staff members, employees when they're empowered and they get that information from their supervisor, telling them how well they're doing and keep doing it, it creates the autonomy as well, to give them that ownership of accountability in their job. And then lastly, just continuing with, training and development to continue down that path and what they need.
And I want to tack on here, and this is something I advise organizations to do all the time. We do all this work in like mission, vision, values, right? And then we don't connect those values to stated leadership behaviors. So we have to, as organizations, have to state what the expected leadership behaviors are. And those leadership behaviors people have to be evaluated against them, right? They also have to be in job descriptions. They have to be incorporated in the interview process. If you want to have a consistent leadership that reflects the values of the organization, those behaviors have to be articulated, and they have to live right within all the appropriate places. So when you're in that mission, vision, values conversation, don't skip the step of leadership behaviors. People skip it. They get all excited about their mission statement, and then they don't make it actionable. They don't make it behavioral. and then it's just a pretty thing on a website.
Mm.
So, so someone asked a question, like, how does it take time to build that trust? Now, obviously, at a one-on-one level, think about just any time, how long it takes to gain trust with or create trust with an individual direct report or with the supervisor. But to create a culture of trust, right? Like we were saying, it really has to be modeled consistently. And I've experienced, some culture turnarounds where you're trying to create a more positive work environment that sometimes take 2 to 3 years, but with concentrated effort. I don't know, what would you both think in terms of how do you build that culture of trust?
I think from a one-on-one perspective, when you're just talking about you and your employee, that can happen easily. Like that doesn't take as much time. When you look at it from an organizational level or maybe a larger team and what you're doing to with your culture, and if that's what's going to take the time. And you can have all these little one-offs within other teams that have built this trust and everything, but then at the organizational level, that's where it stems from and what we're talking about taking a while to build.
Right. And that's the fertile ground for the healthy conflict, right? When we're creating those cultures of trust.
And that's the consistency component for us, right? It can't just be when the bottom line is really good or when the ratings are very high. It has to be modeled and reinforced at all times consistently. And that's where the true culture, organizational culture of trust is developed, when it's consistent.
Mm. So, and then Kevin, I'll stick with you on this because you mentioned it earlier. What's the role of team diversity as access to innovation-driven conflict? Like, how does that foster an environment for that?
I think we all are, as a leader, and I'm guilty of this, and I would say that most of us probably are. We can get into an interview and get comfortable with somebody who we relate very well with. And it may be that you have a similar background or you share some life experiences together. That's easy for us to do and to fall into that trap. It's also very easy for us to say, and we've all said it, just think like I would think. Hey, I'm going to be on vacation next week. Do what I would do. Well, the reality is that that's very unhealthy. And so when you're going through an interview process, or when you are even just really working on how does your team show up and where do they get their information from, or what are they providing, that preference diversity is so critical. It's so important that, for us, we talk about obtained life experiences a lot in our organization. Those obtained life experiences, we truly feel like brings value from all different walks of life, different perspectives, different socioeconomic levels, all different backgrounds. And so when you get that diversity on a team, now all of a sudden you have a team that's thinking wider and deeper versus this same mindset of just doing what the leader would do. And so for us, I think it's extremely critical from the starting point of an interview through whiteboard sessions, through offsites, whatever it may be, to make sure that your team knows and feels like, hey, I don't want you to think like I would think. I don't want you to do what I would do. I want to hear who you are. I want to hear your perspectives. I want to hear your thoughts on this, and making sure that that's okay. I think we've all been in the room where the leader goes first and says, hey, I think we should do A, B, and C. And suddenly now everybody else feels like we should do A, B, and C. And that's just not healthy. And so for us, we really try to lean into that space of giving our people a voice of their own.
Absolutely. And what would you add to that, Katie, around that diversity? And, I want to call out one thing that you mentioned, Kevin, about the leader going first. I think there's a book I have on my bookshelf. I think it's Simon Sinek, and it says leaders eat last. So as a lead, and this is something I train leaders in coaching skills, to always start a decision-making process with a question, not a speech, right? So you can state what we're going to talk about, but then start it as a question. Create the dialogue as early as possible, right, before the soliloquy, right? Start talking, right? Start getting them talking, right? And the more your people talk, the more they'll also own some of that solution as well.
Absolutely.
Awesome, Katie. How would you add in diversity tying into creating that fertile ground for innovative conflict?
And I think So that's where, and I'm thinking of an example is you might have a group with that diverse perspective at every seat at the table, but how do you start that and bring them all together to do task versus person, or personal versus task? That's where you just have to open it up. And I mean, I'm currently in a situation that is exactly like that. And we're trying to figure out how we create that space, that, radical candor. But it really is educating why everybody's voice is important, bringing their perspective to the table, their experiences. Really, everything that Kevin said is just really what it stems on. And you're going to have individuals who think, well, my opinion's different, so I'm not going to speak up. And how do we create that open space and not being just everybody being a yes man because the boss said this is an idea, what do you guys have? Like, okay, just everybody agrees. We're never going to be innovative. That goes back to, I am reading one of my favorite people here in Cincinnati, Steve Brown. One of his books really focused on conformity versus innovation. We want to be innovative, but we're telling people to stay in line. So how are we going to create that space for them to bring their ideas and create that when they still follow the rules? So really, it goes back to the trust, psychological safety, everything. So you can bring all the ideas, get them to the table, but really, how do we open them up?
Right. So I'm going to throw this question out. Just someone asked it in the Q&A, but it's relevant. So how do you navigate the corporate arena as one of the only leaders that works to create psychological safety? So if you're going around trying to do that, like how do you navigate? How do you make it contagious? Like how do you make an impact?
That's a good question, and it's really hard. It is creating that buy-in. I came on to my position and it was like, we have a strategic plan. You're going to be responsible for our culture. You're going to fix our culture. I'm like, well, it's not just my job. So trying to get everybody, I might own it, but how do we get everybody to play into it? So I can put all the resources, everything out there and say, okay, now you need to go do it. But how do I create that buy-in for them to want to go do the work? So it's just from my level, it's working with my team. I was like, it starts with my team. I was like, we are the problem up here. So until we fix it, then nothing's going to happen. So how can I work with in my position and my internal team to get us all on the same page? And that's stuff that I'm currently working on, the team building. How do we have these healthy dialogue, this conflict? I know we might want to share success stories later on in here, but I'm currently living the nightmare is what I want to call it, and the steps that we're taking to do this. And it is very difficult, and there's not one right or wrong answer. It really depends the players at the table, your type of organization, industry that you're in, and how you're able to approach it.
I would say, for us, it goes back to accountability. We define accountability, and we say, I mentioned earlier that we live in our beliefs, and then from that comes our core values and then our expected behaviors. But for our core value of accountability, we believe in taking ownership in every detail. And we accept the consequences of our actions and inactions. So when we talk, one of our behaviors in accountability is we avoid placing blame. So when we're in a room and we hear somebody say, oh, well, this wasn't my fault, or it was so-and-so's fault, we go back to our expected behaviors of our core value of accountability.
Oh.
That's unacceptable, right? Because that's not who we are as an organization. And so it goes back to our ability to go back to those core values, those belief statements, and those behaviors to create that foundation of understanding and expectation, and ultimately accountability, to say, this is who we are, these are our behaviors. And even for our C-suite, I coach our C-suite of our top 8 executives in our company. And every time I'm able to go in and sit down and have a conversation, there's an accountability measure in those conversations to say, where are we? How are we doing? And remember, we're not placing blame on others. So for us, it does come back, like you mentioned before, Stephanie, that that it can't just be you have core values, it has to be the behaviors that are demonstrating those core values.
Right. And if you notice, Kevin said, we have that behavior that ties back to the core value, right? So he actually articulated exactly, what I mentioned, and that's how you hold people accountable. We have a lot of great thoughts in the chat. Jennifer brings up a good point. The talkers like myself are approachable and talk to you, sit with you, and make you feel safe before the meeting. Personal relationships, do they enable you to speak up? I'm going to say sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Sometimes people don't want to disappoint the people they have really good relationships with. They don't want to challenge the person they have that good relationship with. So how do those personal relationships really create that safety, or sometimes maybe make us hindered in coming forward?
You can go.
Either one. Katie or Katie. Let's say Katie.
So you were saying, how does it hinder us with those personal relationships?
Well, help or hinder, right? If we have those personal relationships, does it make it easier or harder to then challenge?
The HR answer is all situational. So
right.
What is that personal relationship and your comfort level with them? Is it one that you can be transparent, honest, and give that whatever type of feedback you need to, or is it someone who is going to take everything personally? Situational and how you approach it. Understand when you understand your team members and what the best way is to get to them. I think it's harder when it's personal. You can't draw the line as well. So trying to figure out how are they going to react. But yeah, it's a little difficult, but when you get comfortable in these conversations and talking about conflict, that helps you. It makes it easy to draw that line. So I can easily talk about it because in HR, you just cut yourself off from most people. You don't want to get have any personal connections with anybody. So it's a lot easier. So it's easier for me to coach someone and say, oh, this is nothing. You can just take it this direction. But then those feelings get in the way that you just can't help. And so it's kind of just practice is what helps.
And we have a really good comment from Shannon in the chat. Shannon's an awesome leader, happen to know her. We try to give people different ways to communicate ideas. Not everyone is ready to speak up in a meeting, but might be willing to do that one-on-one or via email and ideas board or something like that. Sometimes it's about the method of communication. And I think that's really important. We can't count people out or just count speaking up in a meeting as that indication of psychological safety to create safe space for conflict.
Yeah, so I will say just an example of that. We have a board member on our executive board who she up until this year was the only female on our entire executive board, and she and I are very close. And she would be in the board meetings and really talking about the direction of our enterprise and what are we doing, where are we going. And she's very much a processor. She takes the time to really think and process and be really intentional before she responds. So she's been in a room numerous times where the men have been more than willing to step up and say things and really dominate the situation. And she'll come back in a few days or maybe even a couple of weeks and want to add in some really incredibly thought out, deep context that completely gets dismissed because it wasn't in the room. And so for us, we've spent a lot of time leaning into recognizing just that point, that not everybody communicates the same way. I'm a storyteller. I'm an extrovert. I will give you my opinion, whether you ask for it or not. And I'll do so in a loving way. But she is one who, she'll call me 3 weeks later and say, hey, I'm thinking about this. I'm like, well, this was a month ago, why are we still here? But I realized that that's just the way that she communicates. That's the way that she, processes. And there's so much value in that. So it's important that we really take the time to understand that not all of us show up the same way and communicate the same way. I mean, if we're not careful, we really do lose great perspectives when we really limit to the way that we think or like to communicate.
When you have staff members like that with that same mentality and how they want to communicate, it's how do you build on that? So you're bringing up these great points. This is awesome. Why didn't you feel like you wanted to share? They can open up, build that trust to build up their capacity to eventually be at that part of their career where they are ready and willing to speak up in those meetings. So it goes back to empowerment, raising your voice. So when you can empower them as their leader, and then even just being at the table and say, so and so made a great point about this. Would you be willing to speak to it? Like, and building that trust prior. Like, do you care if I bring this up? Do you care if I shout your name out to share with us? Like, that's going to help build that trust in those situations.
That's great. That's great. All right, let's get to a specific example. So I'll throw this back to you, Kevin. Share a specific example of how an organization or team fostered constructive conflict and leveraged it for results.
Yeah, so for us, that's unfair because we're in the movie and TV making business. And for us, conflict is everything. When we get into a room, our writers and producers, they have to have conflict. They have to have different thoughts and perspectives. They have to be able to really challenge one another. Otherwise, we're going to end up with the exact same movie year after year after year, and the same storyline, the same everything. And so for us, we really love and open up this idea of creating conflict. Obviously it goes back to the trust level. It goes back to the open communication and really leaning into some of those spaces. But everything that we do has a bit of conflict in it. Do we start with this scene? Do we choose this actor or actress? What movies, what music score are we going to use? Where are we going to film this? All of those types of things. So for us, like, that's how we do business. That's how we make our content. But even beyond that, we recognize that some of those things can feel very personal. And so if I come in or one of our writers comes in and they're getting their script ripped apart, and it's like, no, this is not good. This is not the direction we want to go. That can feel very personal. So one of the things for us is really leaning in on the EQ, on the emotional intelligence of somebody to recognize the difference between, hey, I don't like your work, but it doesn't mean I don't like you. It's not a knock on you that this movie isn't going to make it to the big screen. It's not a knock on you that this TV show isn't going to air, but it isn't something that's right for us. And so leaning into that space for us is where we spend a lot of time. And every, the third Wednesday of every month, we have a university where we really lean into these core competencies and these emotional intelligence skills that allow us to communicate and allow us to have conflict effectively. But truthfully, if it weren't for that, I mean, again, we laugh at some of these networks that have the same Christmas movies year in, year out. Well, for us, like, we don't want that. We want it to be different. We want it to be challenging. And so you have to have conflict in that. But I'll go back to the point of, having a high level of emotional intelligence to recognize the difference between conflict versus me, or conflict versus the project or the bigger picture. So I think those are really big for us, especially when we talk about some of the content we're creating.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I will forgive you, Kevin, for knocking the Hallmark Christmas movies.
I did not knock Hallmark, but I will say we outperform Hallmark every week for the last 2 years.
I'm just kidding. I'm just keeping it light. All right. So we have some really great comments that you're all sparking, right? And said, Jennifer shared, we never force anyone to talk, just get everyone out of the house, just get everyone sort of out doing something. And John shared, regarding feedback in a meeting, often as leaders, we go into a meeting having spent lots of time. We've spent lots of time thinking on things, and we kind of throw it out there and we expect everybody to process it and absorb it and have that response immediately. And sometimes people genuinely need more processing time.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with that tangible.
Bringing those diverse perspectives. Like, they need a process. Like, I don't know what exactly you're talking about. I need to have a little bit more background understanding of what's going on before you're able to process.
No, absolutely. So Katie, do you have a specific example of how an organization or team fostered constructive conflict and leveraged it?
Yes, sure don't. As I mentioned, I am currently going through this right now. So I will give you the example of where our issues are. Maybe a small win for me, working in my department. When I first came in, my department was very much, they never spoke up because the leaders They made the decisions. They didn't say the why. That it is what it is. They never had any input when it's shared. When I came in, I pushed my CEO and I questioned everything. He told me that's what he needed, so I did it. And that opened up the doors to me continuing to push. My team saw that. I was asking them, what do you think? And they were like, well, nobody's ever asked us. And I'm just like, you're the experts in our department to help our organization. So I need your feedback on what's going on. You're in the day-to-day of this. So that brought, oh my gosh, I get to say what my opinion is and to help lead that work that's going. And so from there, our CEO was like, so and so, they just seem a lot different now. They're happy to be here. I just see something different. They're putting this stuff out there, and I'm like, that's what happens when you build that trust with your staff. So that was a win for me when I first started. But my current situation is my team. We have those diverse perspectives and backgrounds. We finally have this team built. We don't know how to work with each other. We finally get our meetings going regularly scheduled. And what you said, we come with all of our ideas and everything we built up behind the scenes of what we want to present. And we present it in a manner of, well, this is my opinion, this is my work, so it is what it is. And then the clashing begins, because then people start taking that as personal conflict, and we don't get to decision making. We fail at what we need to do in those meetings. So that's what we're working through right now. How the team building, understanding each other. Little plug for Cloverleaf, our personality assessments. We are using those. The coaching tips that come through is how do we work with one another, understanding what they bring to the table. And maybe if I say it this way, it rubs them the wrong way. So how do I work around that? So we're just a new team, and we're trying to figure this out. And it's just whatever you can take to understand one another, what you bring, what they bring. So we're a work in progress right now. So hopefully pretty soon I'll have a success story.
Awesome. Well, you're in progress. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes conscious effort. It takes also trust in yourself, right? It takes sometimes giving people the benefit of the doubt, right? And just not sort of leading into everything. Awesome.
Crucial conversation comes into play too. The benefit of the doubt. Did you mean to say it? Like, let me help me understand what you meant by that, right? And giving them that opportunity to turn it around.
Yeah, like not sweeping in with your judgment, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this is another good question. We want some strategy. So Kevin, give.
Oh no, she froze. You froze up, Stephanie.
Uh-oh.
Oh no.
Well, so Stephanie, you were going to ask about strategy. So for us, to clarify just a little bit. So our team, my team is the organizational development team inside of our organization. We all have an HR background. We all have some sort of certification in human resources, but we aren't the human resources team. Our organization is set up very unique that we have an HR team, and then we have an organizational development team. My team, we have 3 certified coaches on our team. And so when we talk about strategy and leaning into these relationships, we spend a lot of time coaching individuals within our organization. I mentioned before, I get to work with our senior leadership team, and our other 2 coaches work with different levels in our organization. And we spend a ton of time on the emotional intelligence and the EQ stuff, on just recognizing, where am I coming from? Where am I struggling? Where am I successful? Shameless plug to Cloverleaf. For us, we start all of our conversations based out of some of the assessments and some of the learnings that we get from Cloverleaf. But it allows us to have those one-on-one, really good reflective conversations to help build an individual contributor in a space where they can show up and really lean into their team relationships better. I'll say one of the biggest things that we work with right now is coaching up. I saw someone in the comments earlier mention something about, middle management, and we recognize that when it comes to, conflict, a lot of our conflict is coaching up. And so we spend a ton of time coaching through those skills of how do I have a really challenging conversation with my leader. Stephanie shared some thoughts earlier on, on some of that coaching mindset of like, hey, just starting a conversation. Hey, can I give you some feedback? Or would you be open to us having a really hard conversation? Can we have some safe space to be open and vulnerable with one another right now? Those are openings that can really change the dynamic of tension. So we're very fortunate to have that. Our team also does a ton of workshops. We just got back 2 weeks ago from working on an offsite with one of our teams on, they're going through a really interesting dynamic where 8 of the 10 folks on that team have turned over in the last year. So we spent, a full day offsite really going through the Strengths Finders assessment and leaning into some of those spaces and recognizing, again, that diversity of thought and experience, or even strengths. How do we work well together? How do we also recognize where our conflicts may really rub up against one another? And so those are 2 big things that my team spend a ton of time in, leaning into the coaching and the offsite work. So those work really well for us. But again, that's also very unique for our organization that is set up with the intentionality to be able to serve our staff in a really cool way.
Awesome. Kevin, I love that you brought up, I literally spend my life helping leaders go from boss to coach. So, and it's we think it's super complicated. It's really not. It sometimes just means not talking, right? It literally just means asking, not telling, right? It literally means getting curious every single day and challenging your assumptions, right? And it's just about practicing that, right? It's like, I say that coaching is the language of leadership. And if you can practice that language over and over again, the same way that you would in learning another language, right? Then you practice it over and over again. That's how you get stronger in it, right? And so I'm glad that you brought up the role of coaching. It can get a bad rap because there's no barrier to entry in the world of coaching. And so, but as a skill, it is extremely powerful and can really create environments of safety and cohesion, really. So thank you for sharing that. Katie, share maybe some of your go-to conflict resolution strategies.
Yeah, so my number one, the active listening piece is what you just talked about. And it's like, that's so valuable because it's that awkward pause that gets somebody thinking and finally will start giving all their thoughts and talk through things. I got so intrigued by all the comments that are happening in the chat, and somebody was talking about the fear of retaliation. Yep, it's real. And it's something that we are battling. And it's, how do I build the trust when people are so fearful that if they give honest feedback, the retaliation piece? And I'm like, how do we do this? So creating that space. So, okay, anonymous surveys, but I don't trust this survey. So let me give you a platform that that we use with our members that you for sure is anonymous. Give me everything you have. We did so good to start with. Then this most recent one, I'm seeing those comments about fear of retaliation. They don't want to say it. They think we're going to know who it is. And I'm just like, shoot, what's going on? How do we get back to it? So with that, our organization is big on, we're really working in the co-creation space. So again, the past has always been top down, decisions are made, this is how it is what it is, don't ask questions. How do we bring those that are working out in the field, bring them to the table and help us? Like our leadership has come on in the past year or so, they get it. We've been training them how to do this kind of work, and invite those voices to the table because we're so far removed anymore from it. Like we need to understand, and they're the voices that we need to hear. So co-creation is big in our organization, and just setting up that open communication, collaboration, and the regular feedback. Again, something as small as performance management, me bringing in the quarterly feedback sessions this year has done wonders. I was surprised, like when I get the feedback saying, Thank you. I learned so much about my staff member that I would have never learned. And those are those opportunities to have those conversations.
This is a good question. So let's say the leader has so many people that they're accountable for with little time for kind of like a lot of long one-on-one. How do you reach as many people as possible as leaders?
Mentorship is huge. We have a mentorship program that we really lean into from all new employees get a mentor, and then we have our C-suite has either elected to be a mentor and or has appointed a couple mentors. So for us, that's a really great opportunity to continue to learn new skills, develop new skills outside of the normal everyday hierarchy that you may be in. So we love mentorship.
Yeah, mentorship and having so many, you always have to have some type of touch base, anything. And if you're going to check in with them at all, just ask one simple question: how they're doing and what do they need? That is something enough for them to be like, well, and that could open up a can of worms and somebody you might have to go support, but it's like, I'm doing great, I'm kicking butt at what I'm doing, so nothing here. So if you have such a large team, and I know that's difficult, just any simple check-in just to see how they are and how you can support them. And if you can't provide the support, how do you connect them with somebody that can?
Absolutely. And I just want to share, I used to manage a team of like 12 and sometimes 14 people globally. And it got really unwieldy to have those one-on-ones. So eventually I did put in a structure where people were getting that support from like a lead. But even if you have it monthly, right? Even if you can't have it, right, bi-weekly or weekly, even if you still have to have some touch point. There has to be some touch point, even if it's monthly, or maybe it's even if it's in small groups, but that one-on-one is going to be really critical to building that trust and building those relationships. So Kevin and Katie, I want to thank you so much for your brilliance, for your creativity and the innovation of your answers. We really appreciate you giving of your time. We know your time is valuable and precious. So thank you so much for sharing. We want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We hope that you'll continue to join us for these experiences, and we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.